And I am the Acting Assistant Deputy Minister of the Procurement Branch at Public Services and Procurement Canada. Joining me today are two of my colleagues from our Departmental Oversight Branch, Catherine Poulin, Director General of Integrity and Forensic Accounting Services, and Claude Kateb, Director General of the Industrial Security Sector.
I would like to focus my brief remarks on two areas. First, I will provide some general background with respect to roles, responsibilities, and process in contracting security. And second, I will provide an overview of the specific procurement process involving NUCTEC that is the focus of today's meeting. With regards to security and contracting, each federal department is responsible for protecting sensitive information and assets under its control, not only in its own operations, but also through any contracts it manages. Federal departments are also responsible for determining if suppliers will require access to sensitive information, assets, or sites. In its capacity as a common service provider, Public Services and Procurement Canada has two distinct responsibilities with respect to security in contracting. En premier lieu,
first, PSPC's Contract Security Program is responsible for security screening companies and personnel. The program also provides the necessary security clauses to be included in each contract based on the information provided by the client department. Second, PSPC's procurement branch ensures that the procurement is undertaken in a way that reflects the security profile and that suppliers have received the necessary clearance prior to contract award. It should be noted that the level of security required is determined by the client department in consultation with their departmental chief security officer. These security requirements are captured at a high level through a security requirements checklist, which is sent to PSPC along with other documents.
When procurement officers at Public Services and Procurement Canada receive these documents, and where security requirements have been identified, they contact the Contract Security Program. The program, in turn, provides the procurement officer with security clauses to be used in the solicitation and contract. Prior to awarding a contract with security requirements, our procurement officers must confirm with our Contract Security Program that the supplier holds the appropriate security clearance. Mr. Chair, I will now move on to the procurement at issue, which involves NUCTEC. En décembre 2019,
in December 2019, Public Services and Procurement Canada issued a competitive request for standing offer with the requirement to establish two standing offers for the supply of two types of security screening equipment, conveyor-style X-ray machines and walk-through metal detectors. This standing offer would be for Global Affairs Canada and other federal departments on an as and when requested basis. The various trade agreements to which Canada is a signatory applied, and international suppliers were eligible to bid on this process. A standing offer is not a contract. It is an offer from a supplier to provide goods or services at pre-arranged prices under set terms and conditions, when and if required. It is not a contract until the government issues a call-up against the standing offer, which is a notice to a supplier to provide the goods or services in accordance with their standing offer. It is important to note that the government is under no obligation to purchase until such time as a call-up has been issued.
Standing offer for screening equipment closed in early April. 7 offers were received for the supplier of conveyor-style X-ray machines, and all were evaluated against the requirements of the request for standing offer. This included the need for offerers to demonstrate that they met a set of 63 mandatory technical requirements to be declared responsive. In accordance with the request for standing offer, the responsive offer with the lowest evaluated price would be selected. 3 of the 7 offers received were determined to be responsive, meaning that 3 of the 7 offers met the 63 mandatory technical requirements. Of these 3, NUCTEC had the lowest evaluated price and was therefore awarded the standing offer. I would like to conclude, Mr. Chair, by noting that to date, no call-ups have been issued against the standing offer. Mr. Chair, thank you for the opportunity to provide this overview, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. And now we'll go with Global Affairs Canada.
Thank you, Chair, members of the committee. My name is Dan Danaher. I am the Assistant Deputy Minister of the International Platform at Global Affairs Canada. My team and I are responsible for providing the infrastructure required by Canada's network of missions abroad. That includes all real property, common services, and physical installations. We are grateful for the opportunity today to provide some background on Global Affairs Canada's recent procurement of X-ray equipment for those missions. Firstly, we at Global Affairs are seized by the importance of keeping our employees, our information, and our assets safe. We have a robust security framework that continuously monitors the threat and risk environments, and we adapt our approach at those threats and risks as those threats and risks change. We work with our closest partners globally, exchange ideas and approaches. We learn from each other. Our installations are often complex, including high security zones, as well as operations and public access or reception and public zones. X-ray equipment is used in the latter and helps screening deliveries and visitors to the mission. While this equipment represents a small part of our installations, every component is important for the good functioning and safety of our missions abroad. In mid-July, PSPC awarded a standing offer worth up to $6.8 million over 5 years for NUCTEC X-ray equipment. To date, Global Affairs has not availed itself of this arrangement and has no NUCTEC equipment in its missions abroad. In the days following the award of the standing offer, the Minister of Foreign Affairs directed me to conduct a review of how we acquire security equipment such as X-ray machines. I turned to Deloitte Canada, and they conducted an exhaustive review. Their findings are currently in draft form, but I am sufficiently satisfied with their recommendations that we have already begun to implement them. Firstly, Deloitte found that Global Affairs Canada followed all applicable policies. While that is reassuring, they also found that those policies asked two key questions that fundamentally influenced our approach. Would the equipment A, handle sensitive information, or B, be connected to our information networks? Because this equipment is used in a public access zone, and the answer to those questions was negative, the procurement proceeded through normal processing, without the application of a national security exemption or higher levels of security, which my PSPC colleagues can explain should the chair or committee members be interested. I should point out here that Global Affairs Canada has in place a national security exemption for the acquisition of equipment we use inside the more secure zones of our chancelleries. Deloitte, however, recommended that we consider that the technical specifications themselves, even for detection equipment in the public zone, should only be accessible to companies with higher levels of security clearance. Further, they recommended that we consider that service personnel who had access to the equipment should be security cleared. These two steps would go a long way to future-proofing our public zones from future threats, should they emerge. We are currently working through the mechanics of implementing these recommendations. However, I can confirm today that Global Affairs Canada will not avail itself of the standing offer awarded in July 2020, and we have already begun the process with PSPC to design a new procurement strategy that will implement Deloitte's recommendations. We thank the committee for giving us this opportunity to explain how we are continuously improving and adapting as we strive to keep our people, information, and assets safe. I'm pleased to take your questions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Danaher. Much appreciated. I understand we're having a little bit of difficulty with your sound, but we'll try and make certain that if we need to interrupt briefly to correct that, we'll keep on top of that as we go through. Thank you. So we'll now start our questions in the first round, and we'll start with Mr. Paul Hughes. You have 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the witnesses for being here with us today to answer our questions. If I've heard what you said regarding the first assessment that was conducted and then by Deloitte, but my problem is still that the Government of Canada accepted to go forward with a request for a standing offer with NUCTEC. So, Ms. Mullen, what is your current assessment of NUCTEC?
Hello, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. Let me begin, first of all, by giving you a feel for my role within the organization so that you understand where I'm coming from with my remarks today. As the Director General of Partnerships and Risk Mitigation at the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity within the Communication Security Establishment, I'm responsible for three main functions. First is building trust-based partnerships with all levels of government, Canadian critical infrastructure, and the private industry. Second is providing cybersecurity architecture advice and guidance to our partners and the Canadian public at large based on the threat landscape that we observe. And thirdly, implementing risk mitigation programs aimed at reducing the risks identified through our assessments of technologies on the basis of our understanding of the threat environment, which is informed by both classified...
Excusez-moi, Madame Mullen.
Oh, sorry, Ms. Mullen. I don't want to be impolite, but I only have 6 minutes to ask my questions. Do you have a direct answer regarding my question about the security risk assessment for NUCTEC? Could you confirm that NUCTEC is really related to the Chinese Communist Party and under its direct control, yes or no?
So CSE was not asked to assess NUCTEC as a part of the Global Affairs Canada standing offer that we're here to speak about today.
Merci. Merci, Madame.
Thank you. Thank you. My next question will be for public services. So if we haven't even asked for an assessment, how can we justify that the Government of Canada provides a contract with NUCTEC? Is that because we're just pretending it's not happening? We didn't want to know? Because if we hadn't said anything, a contract may have been awarded. I understand that there wasn't one, but there could have been one in July. Could you explain why?
Alors, Monsieur le Président, pour la question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this question regarding the procurement for NUCTEC. The needs and level of security associated with the needs were established by Global Affairs. They provided us with the information. At that time, no potential security risk was flagged. Therefore, we went ahead with the procurement in a way that was open to all companies. But you knew that in terms of the U.S. Transportation Agency, since 2014, it has been calling for caution for using this NUCTEC equipment at airports. We must have known about that in Canada. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this question. Were we aware of the information provided emanating from the U.S.? Yes, we were aware. That being said, the process, as I mentioned, did not flag any security impacts. And in terms of procurement process, we do not know who will be awarded or will award the contract eventually. Right now, this is a standing offer. So the process went forward in an open manner since nothing was flagged. Honestly, could you explain to the committee why, given everything we know regarding China right now, we just voted on a motion in the House of Commons asking for answers from Huawei? How can we do business with a company that is directly related to the Chinese Communist Party without going ahead with an in-depth security assessment?
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this question. Once again, in terms of process on our end, the procurement processes are based on the security threats and risks identified by our client, which in this case was Global Affairs. Our procurement approach currently does not exclude companies or businesses from specific countries. At the time of the procurement process, there were no identified security risks, and that's why the process went ahead as it did. Now, for Global Affairs, could you answer the question, why did you not think that security systems should be put in place?
We did do a security review, Mr. Chair, prior to the award of this or the issue of the request for standing offer. But again, that security review really was based on two fundamental questions that we asked in accordance with the Government of Canada's security policy. When those two questions were considered negative, this was considered low risk, and it was the paradigm that existed at the time, and that has now changed.
Thank you for that response. Mr. Weiler, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd also like to thank all of our witnesses for coming to join and speak with our committee today. I'd like to jump right into it here. I was hoping that witnesses could explain a little bit more about what our government does to protect against unethical and illegal business practices.
So, Mr. President, thank you for the question. I'm not sure if that was directed to Public Services and Procurement Canada, but I will start. From a procurement perspective, we do have the integrity regime, which is part of the work that we do, as well as I mentioned during my opening remarks, the contract security program. So briefly, the contract security program does a few things. First, once we receive a requisition from a client department that indicates security obligations, the contract security program is engaged to ensure that the appropriate security clauses are included in the tender documents as well as the resulting contracts. And in advance of a contract being awarded, the procurement officers will check in with the contract security program to ensure that the company has the appropriate security clearances to meet or to match the security requirements of the procurement. In addition to that, we manage the department manages the integrity regime, and I've got colleagues from the department who are available to provide more details if necessary. In essence, what that does is it ensures that companies have not been tried or convicted of offenses, and if they have been, they are placed on an inadmissibility list or an ineligibility list, where we ensure that we don't undertake procurements with them. So briefly, that's from a Public Service Procurement Canada perspective.
Thank you for that. And with this in mind, what implications did the integrity regime and the other measures that you mentioned have on the new tech standing offer?
So with regards to both of these in terms of contract security and integrity, I'll deal with the first one. First, in terms of contract security, as I indicated, once we received the requirement from Global Affairs Canada, there was no security requirement associated with it. Therefore, the procurement went ahead in the manner that it did. In advance of awarding the contract, in advance of awarding the standing offer, the procurement team did a check-in with the integrity regime to ensure that NUCTEC was not identified, and at that time, and NUCTEC was not part of the inadmissibility list.
Thank you. And with this in mind, have you considered any, and more, I heard in the opening remarks about the recommendations that were made by Deloitte. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more to how, as a government, we're considering new steps to protect the security of our workplaces abroad.
That's probably, Mr. Chair, that question is best fielded by me. We do have a very robust threat and risk assessment process. It's called the Global Security Framework. It's been in place for a number of years now. And we have a very, very large security team that focuses on it, and we deliver those installations abroad. So it's pretty robust. This equipment hasn't previously been considered to be sensitive.
Mr. Danger, can you just hold on for a second? We just need to check some technicalities. You're not coming through clearly yet. So just hold on for a second if you would. And I will pause the time for you, Mr. Weiler. Sorry?
You.
Mr. Chair, it might also be good to a good time.
Okay.
Do you want me to try to hold this closer to my mouth?
If you could try, Mr. Danaher, we'll try and see if it works or not. The issue is the sound quality is not sufficient that our interpreters can interpret. So what I'm going to suggest is that you try again. We're going to ask you to try and speak as slowly as possible, and we'll see if our interpreters can hear, and then we'll see if this works. Do try and hold the mic closer to your mouth, but not directly right at it, and then we'll see if that works. Thank you.
Thank you. And I will try to speak a little clearer and louder, okay? So just as, thank you again for the question, just to confirm, we do have a very robust global security framework that is constantly assessing the threats and the risks abroad, and we are always assessing our vulnerabilities. This equipment was not seen as overly sensitive equipment, so it did not apply, or the national security exemption that we had did not apply. It fell within a paradigm that basically allowed it to be competed out in the open in that way. Does that answer the member's question?
That does indeed. And I'm just hoping you can maybe expand on that a little bit more on what level of risk was thought that this equipment could provide.
Essentially, because the equipment stands alone in a room and is screening visitors' equipment, there's a briefcase or a bag or something like that.
Mr. Danaher, excuse me for interrupting again. Could you, it seemed to come through a little clearer when you spoke a little bit slower. That way the interpreters could pick you up. Could you try that and see? I realize I'm bringing up your usual cadence, but if you would try that, I would appreciate it.
Okay, I will do my best to slow down. So this equipment is in the public zone, public access zone outside of our chanceries, or just in the very exterior of our chanceries, and it is used to screen visitors' belongings. It is not typically plugged into our network, and it doesn't handle classified information. And as a consequence, it doesn't fall within two of the key questions of the government policy on information security, and was just put out to broad tender, as you heard earlier.
Great, thank you for that. And Mr. Chair, how long do I have left?
Mr. Weiler, you've got another 30 seconds.
Okay. Well, maybe just quickly, if maybe the witness from PSPC, Mr. Arachi, could mention how does a standing offer differ from, or how is it different from a contract per se?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. So a standing offer is essentially a pre-qualified tool where a supplier has been, or multiple suppliers have been selected to provide goods or services at predetermined prices under established or set terms and conditions. A standing offer is actually not a contract. There is no obligation on the part of the Government of Canada to procure anything using a standing offer. In fact, a contract is only entered into when the Government of Canada issues what is referred to as a call-up to the supplier. And what a call-up is basically an order for a certain amount of goods or services in accordance with the terms of the standing offer. So until such a time as a call-up is offered, there is no obligation on the part of the Government of Canada with regards to that procurement instrument.
Thank you for that, and thank you, Mr. Weiler. Ms. Vignola, you have 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. I listened to you closely. I understand when the call for offer did not include any security measures because this was only for visitors. But now, since it's difficult to know everything that's going on within a business, but I saw that there were 5 contracts between Border Services and NUCTEC, even though NUCTEC was condemned in 2010 for actions of corruptions that they had used honey traps to get some investors, and in 2017 they were asked to cooperate with the Chinese government, and since then there have been 5 contracts.
I'd like to understand how a company with that history can be seriously considered for a standing offer. I just don't understand how that works, and I'd really like to understand.
Alors, bonjour, merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure if it was directed towards public works and procurement, but I will provide a response. As mentioned earlier, the procurement process that was used to arrive at the standing offer, because there were no security requirements, it went forward, and NUCTEC was one of the companies that responded and that was found to be compliant with all the requirements. In terms of procurement, we did check with the program, and as the company was not identified or flagged at that level, it was eligible to provide a standing offer. So if I understand you correctly, Mr. Yarachi, despite this history of going forward with dumping, of honey traps, bribery, there was nothing flagged within the government that perhaps this company would not be up to snuff? And if it was one of the lowest bidders with such a history of dumping, shouldn't there have been a little red light going off? I'm not blaming the officials. I want to be really clear on that. I just want the process to be improved. I want our security to be and our safety to be ensured. Despite that whole history, there were no little red lights that went off. Nobody anywhere said, oh, that company can no longer be on our list because we can't be sure we can trust them.
Merci beaucoup pour la question.
Thank you very much for this question, Mr. Chair. Yes, we do all want to improve the systems and approaches to make sure that Canadians' safety and security is respected. Excuse me. Some issues were raised with NUCTEC. That was part. Well, we had some information on the company, but in terms of procurement, we had limited options. With the standing offer, the company had met all the requirements. It's one of the sectors we're looking at with our colleagues at other departments to see whether there's a way to decrease potential risks. That being said, as I mentioned, at the beginning of a procurement process, we do not know who will be eligible and who will receive the standing offer. So there are approaches we use to diminish risks. For example, having a well-identified security level at the beginning of the process.
Okay.
All right. So identifying the security level, and NUCTEC met the requirements. And
30 seconds.
C'est bon.
Okay. 30 seconds. In the case of Nuktek, sometimes, well, maybe not in Nuktek's case, but there was some dumping done, and the Chinese government may have provided some funds to allow that dumping to happen. Have you checked to see whether this company has required funds from a foreign government to allow it to get through the cracks? Thank you for the question. On the issue of funding from governments, that's something we're looking at. Many countries are looking at that, and it is a point of friction between countries, not just between China and other countries, but even between Canada and the US, European countries. The definition of funding, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, that is all part of what we are looking at. It's a fairly complex issue because there are so many different approaches and ways that countries can try to help fund various companies, that it is something we're looking at, but that's a problem that almost all countries across the world are facing. That is to see who is funding how.
You have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I think what's most interesting to note is that we seem to be back at square one when it comes to procurement now that Global Affairs has decided not to avail itself to the standing order. So it leads me to ask the question that somebody at either Global Affairs or PSPC clearly didn't do their homework ahead of time, and they would have gone ahead with purchasing the Nuktek if the media hadn't broken the story. So whose responsibility was it to do the homework on this?
So, Mr. Chair, I think that's a good question. I mean, the assessment started with Global Affairs. Global Affairs assessed this procurement in a way, as I said before, that complied with policy, and the procurement started without us requesting a national security exemption. Now, whether or not a national security exemption would have led us to a different outcome is another question. I can't speculate if it would have. But that it does start with the assessment at the beginning of whether or not this conformed with policy, and for whatever reason, it was the paradigm at the time. Those two questions, once they were answered, were deemed sufficient to go ahead with the procurement that resulted in Nuktek getting the standing offer.
So maybe you can help.
We stopped.
Maybe you can help me through this. It might be more appropriate for PSPC because I know with PSPC, pursuant to the ineligibility and suspension policy, they may sometimes deem a company ineligible or suspended from entering into certain contracts if it's engaged in specified offenses within specified timeframes. So the policy may also apply to a company, or in some cases its subsidiary, that was convicted of similar offenses in the past 3 years in a jurisdiction other than Canada. Once you brought on Deloitte, you did your review, or maybe this is for PSPC, I don't know. Has Nuktek or its subsidiaries been convicted of offenses specified in the ineligibility and suspension policy, or of similar offenses in a jurisdiction other than Canada within the past 3 years?
I think, Mr. Chair, that's a question for PSPC.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe the answer to that question is no, but I will turn to my colleague, Catherine Poulin, just to get confirmation.
Thank you for the question. And you were right, the answer is no. So we are aware of the allegation, but none of those allegations, we haven't found any charges nor conviction listed in the policy associated with those behavior.
So how how would you go about to investigate whether bidders have been convicted of offenses specified by this policy?
So we're doing some verification, and we haven't found, throughout those verification, we haven't found any charges nor conviction under one of the offenses listed in the policy. Consequently, NUCTEC has been founded not to be ineligible to be awarded that contract.
Okay. You know, we talked a little bit about subsidies, and through you, Mr. Chair, there's been an ongoing debate about China's role in the world, and a lot of red baiting, a lot of really, I think, problematic framings around China, particularly some of my conservative colleagues who have a newfound disdain for the way that they run their economy. So through you, Mr. Chair, can anybody care to comment on Canada's obligations as it relates to FIPA in allowing for broad bidding from countries like China? Because I'm hearing in some of the rhetoric that they should automatically be excluded from bidding on contracts, yet it was our conservative friends who entered us into, I think, a 30-year plus contract.
Mr. Chair, I don't know to whom the question would be best.
Probably PSPC, just because, you know, like we're in a global trade agreement, and I'm hearing a lot of really derogatory comments as it relates to China and its, you know, state-run, essentially it's state-run capitalism, and yet it doesn't seem to be the same frame that was used not too long ago when the Conservative government entered into a long and ironclad agreement with China. What would it cost us if we were to try to end any kind of bidding processes from the People's Republic of China under FIPA?
So thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I'll admit that I'm not very familiar with FIPA. What I will say is this: we have obligation in terms of trade agreements with numerous countries around the world, including to the World Trade Organization. And Canada's our approach in terms of procurement has been that, again, unless there are specific needs or requirements, particularly in the area of security, that our default is to open procurements, federal procurements, to the international community. So I can't quantify what the cost would be. What I can tell you is this: companies who are not happy with the way procurement is done have the option of either returning to the Canadian International Trade Tribunal or to the federal courts in instances where we undertake procurements that are not aligned either with our legal obligations or with our trade obligations.
And again, taking the subject matter of NUCTEC and setting the personal opinions on it aside, when you talk about subsidies, how would state subsidies in a company like NUCTEC differ from the subsidies that we provide to, say, oil and gas?
If we can get a very quick answer on that, appreciate it. Thank you.
It's Lorenzo. Sorry, it's Public Services Procurement Canada. I'm not sure that we could answer that question. I think the issue of subsidies is a fairly complex one. And as I was mentioning, I think a lot of different countries use a lot of different approaches or mechanisms to be able to support domestic industries, which are the subject of ongoing discussions at the World Trade Organization and other international fora.
Thank you for the contribution. I will note I'm still having some audible troubles with the feedback and the echoes.
Thank you, Mr. Green, and we're trying to keep an eye on that. Ms. Poulin, if you have to speak again, if you could move your mic up just a touch, it might be helpful if you have to ask. Thank you. We're now going into our second round, and we'll go with Mr. McCauley. And Mr. McCauley, you have 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you, witnesses. I have to ask, why was a national security exemption not used for this? We've seen the government use it for paper clips, photocopy paper, jackets. Why not for something as vital as this?
Yeah, as Mr. Chair, I think that gets to the heart of this question here. It wasn't because we applied the tests that we've always been applying when we bought equipment that doesn't plug into our network.
They just didn't consider it a security issue. Okay, great. I'm going to move over to CSC. How would have NUCTEC received a security clearance? Anyone?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I actually think that would be more appropriately answered by the industrial security folks at PSPC, as CSE is not actually involved in that.
Okay, Mr. Ratchey, how would a company that's owned by the Communist Party, it's a state-owned company, how would they have received a security clearance?
If you'll permit me, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to answer on behalf of Mr. Irachi.
Yeah, so, and quickly, please, because we're short of time.
Yes. So very quickly, we did not clear that company. We clear the industrial security sector, and contract security program clears Canadian companies. And NUCTEC does not hold a security clearance with the Government of Canada.
I thought I heard Mr. Doniger say that they had passed a security clearance. Would something like this not require security clearance?
So
on such a bid?
I believe, as others have noted, our services in the contract security program are triggered when a security requirement is identified for procurement. And in this particular case,
I find this whole thing just stupefying that something like this just overlooked, and just, again, mind-boggling. The CSC just came out with their cyber threat assessment report. I think it was just today, and very highlighting a lot of issues with state-owned actors, naming China and Russia for the first time. How would, the information that would have been gained from this equipment, how could have been gathered from our embassies? And does CSC have a concern about this?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So normally a supply chain integrity assessment, which is what CSC would perform in support of a department in making a risk-based decision on a procurement for a piece of technology like this.
But, yeah, I'm sorry, maybe I didn't ask the right question. Your threat assessment report just came out today, specifically naming China for the first time and state-sponsored actors attempting, with cyber threats. What kind of information could such state-sponsored actors gather from our embassies from this equipment? Do you share the lack of concern that seems to be coming from Global Affairs and PSPC?
So to be honest, sir, I think that the nature of the X-ray machines over time has evolved such that they are becoming more of interest.
I know, but this is not about the nature of the past. This is about the exact machines that the Government of Canada decided we were going to okay for our embassies.
Understood, sir. And this is exactly why we're working together now to identify this and other types of equipment that perhaps should be flagged in future under procurement activities, because the nature of the technology has evolved such that it actually could gather information that could be of risk to Canada.
If the media hadn't highlighted this issue, would even the CSC have been concerned?
So we, again, only perform these assessments when we're approached by a department who's actually making the acquisition, because it is actually the risk-based decision of the department making the acquisition.
How do we stop this from happening again? Does it start with Global Affairs saying to you, hey, can we bring in state-owned Chinese equipment into our embassies?
So the way this changes in the future is for them to come to us and ask whether the types of equipment that they're looking at should be assessed for supply chain integrity, in which case we do look at ownership as one of the three prongs of things that are assessed.
Mr. Chair, how much time? I think you've answered my question.
Mr. Drouin, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to all the witnesses for taking the time on this important issue. I just want to perhaps get back to global affairs and just determine, and I'd love to hear from CBSA, because I know they're also big purchasers of scanners as well, and I'm not sure if I have the right, if Mr. Harris or Ms. Zafar are the right folks that could answer this, but does CBSA invoke the national security exemption clause when they, or have higher security requirements when they buy similar technology?
Thank you. I'll just check the sound. I was having technical issues, so I will try and speak slowly for the benefit of the interpreters. To date, in our X-ray procurement, our X-ray detection procurement, we have not invoked the national security exemption for that purpose. As has been noted by my colleagues at GAC and Public Service and Procurement Canada, we do a review of the security requirements under the contract security policy. As X-ray equipment does not handle sensitive or technical information in our context, it hasn't to date risen to the bar to trigger enhanced security in that space. And as a result, we do procure X-ray technology from a number of different companies, including from NUCTEC.
And just depending on where the installation of these, again, similar technology would be installed, would the person installing that technology, and I'm not sure if you deal with the company itself or if they deal with a subcontractor, would they require a security clearance to install this, let's say, at the border or anywhere else?
Thank you for the question. Yes, absolutely. We have a number of mitigating interventions that we put in place around this technology. As I said, one of the first ones is obviously to keep it disconnected from our networks and from any Government of Canada networks, which retains its integrity in terms of being a tool that can support our border officers' work in terms of secondary examinations. But the second is, as you mentioned, the fact that anyone affiliated with any of our suppliers would be screened through security processes and would be escorted on site if they were present in our facilities.
And I'd love to get back to global affairs on this. Again, if we take NUCTEC for example, if the company had been successful and were to install in the embassies, does GAC require those who would install that particular technology in our embassies a security clearance? Or and I know X-ray is not exactly top-notch technology. There are some out there, but we can find them in some places where civilians